Hello, Year 5, and welcome back to our unit on computers around us. And today we're going to look a little bit more into programming, and in particular, we're going to look at variables. So that's going to be a key word today, and our learning intention is to know how a computer program uses variables. So I suppose the first thing we should try and figure out is what is a variable? And quite simply, a variable is a way that a computer program stores a piece of information. So, for example, in a game where you've got a score, that's being stored as a variable. The number of cards that go into a car park is stored by a computer as a variable. It works in a similar way to algebra in that you have a name for your variable and then it stores the number. So in algebra, you might have x equals 6, and it works in a similar way when it comes to variables. So you can say lives equals 3. So x equals 3, the variable is called lives. Okay. So what can be stored in a variable? So most people, when they think about variables, will actually think it stores a number, and it can store a number, but it can also store other things. It can store text, and it can store values like true or false, or yes and no. So you can store most things in a variable.
Hello, Mr. Squirrel. You must be using that computer to look up the location of the nuts you buried. Have you ever wondered how a computer remembers things like that? It uses something called variables. Take your nuts, for example. Every year, you gather up lots of nuts and bury them in the ground to keep them safe. Wouldn't it be handy for you to know how many nuts you have and where they all are? That's where variables come in handy. Variables are like a box that a computer can use to store useful information, such as how many friends are at your party. Back to your nuts, though. We could have one variable where we keep a number telling us how many nuts you have. And we could have another variable which tells us the name of the field where you buried them. And every time you bury a new nut, we change the number in the variable. That way, if you've forgotten where your nuts are, you'll be able to find out straight away how many you have and where to find them. So you'll never lose your nuts. I may as well be talking to myself. It's all a riddle. He's just a squirrel.
Okay, so there you can see an example of how a variable might be used by a squirrel, but we're going to think about it in terms of computers. So if you were programming a computer game, for example, you could make your variable called score. And this information would tell you how many points have been won during that game. And that can change during the game. When a character collects a coin or a piece of treasure, that variable could increase. The score could go up by 1 or 100 or 1,000. And throughout the program, that variable's value keeps changing. And that's why it's called a variable, because its value can vary. It can change during the game. So your score will start at 0, but it's going to change as you play. So what do we use variables for? Well, while a program's running, it might need to hold some information in its memory. So we use a variable to store a bit of information. We might also want to change that information, like our score example. It might change during the game. And again, a variable can be updated to have a new value in it. And we might also want to access that information to check a value. So for example, with our score, at the end of the game, you might check the score to see if it's the highest score you've ever had and a new high score. So we're storing, changing, and accessing these values. So a simple program that we could make is a program that displays your name. So the first thing the computer is going to do, the first step in this algorithm, is it's going to ask your name. It's going to store the answer that you give in a variable called your name. That's the name it's given to this variable. And it's going to display hello and the string stored in the variable called your name. So for example, if you put in my name is Dominic, it's going to store Dominic, and then it's going to print hello, and then it's going to print the variable value. So it was Dominic, so it'll say hello Dominic. Hello Dominic. So what about some other examples? So computer games, what about lives? We talked about scores, but lives or health. You might start with a number of lives or 100 health, and that's going to constantly change as you get hit and lose a life. That number is going to go down. But you can also gain health by collecting health tokens. So you might collect some hearts in the game and your life goes back up. That value is changing, and the variable stores the change. It stores the value at any given moment. A supermarket till could use variables to store information about the items you buy. As more items are scanned, the variable total would increase. This value would then calculate how much you need to pay for in your shopping. And car parks with those automated barriers actually count the cars in and out. So they'll count how many cars have gone in and they'll count how many have gone out, and they'll have a running total all the time of how many spaces there should be left in the car park. So here's what I would like you to do. Bronze, describe what a variable is used for in programming. So what are your variables used for? When we're making a program, what are they used for? Loads of examples I've just talked about. Silver, think of a game you've played on a computer and list any information you think is stored by a variable. Gold, explain where a variable will be used in a supermarket checkout. And the challenge is to design a Scratch program that includes a variable. Okay, your vocab is variable, program, and algorithm. Best of luck, guys, and I'll see you soon.